Right. So hello, everyone. I'm Nicole from PowerToFly. I'm a talent advocate, and we have Nicole Tibaldi here with us today, and she is going to be talking about remote work. So I'm really excited to get this chat started. And so just a couple of things before we dive into the chat. Just let everyone know this chat is going to be recorded, so you don't need to take any notes at all right now. Pay full attention to this. And if you want to head back to it, you can jump onto our platform and find the recording after. If you want to ask any private questions, we have the chat, and feel free to message me privately to ask anything anonymously. We have a bunch of questions to cover today, so I'm sure we're going to cover hopefully whatever the question is that may come up, but if not, please feel free to chat. Please be as involved as possible. We love involvement, comments, questions, anything that you want to add, please, and that would be great. So I think we can get started. So Nicole, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, so here's some things about me, I guess. So right now I'm working as an engineering manager at Circle CI. We're highly remote, and I also had been working previously for another company which had one central office and then many, many remote employees. So I've been doing remote work for about 2 years now, and then before that was trying to dip my toe in it because it's something that I really wanted, and I could talk more about that later. I have been focusing my career a lot on, I was a full-time front-end developer prior to starting as an engineering manager. I've done a lot of work around hiring, around agile process, remote work specifically, and kind of making engineering teams work well with product and design. And you can see a little bit more about the companies I've worked for here. And prior to moving to tech, I actually studied music. So I've actually been through a boot camp, which is something that I did another talk with PowerToFly about. Maybe it was like last year. So if anybody's interested in sort of what the boot camp experience was like, that recording is up on the PowerToFly site as well.
Ooh, okay, I'm really interested in that, so I'm definitely going to check that out because I'm like, I think tech is so interesting now. I don't have a background in it at all, so it's really cool to hear that you didn't have a background in it either. And I'm glad that you were able to make the switch. And so here we have some of the questions that we'll be going over. So that's good. And these are all preloaded questions that people submitted when they registered for the chat. And so let's just jump right in because there's so much to cover. So where do you think is the best place to find a remote job?
So this is an interesting question because I don't think there's like any one awesome central place right now. PowerToFly is where I found my first remote job, which was with a company called Manifold up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's where they're based. I was obviously from for those who are working in tech, there are a couple of like GitHub repos that list a lot of what the remote companies are, but I don't think, or at least I found when I was looking for remote jobs, that these are all really well, I guess, recorded or surfaced. Like some will sort of suggest that they're remote when they're not, and some will sort of suggest that they're based in an office location when actually they're open to remote. So it's a really interesting problem of, sorry, I'm hearing a lot of background noise.
Yeah, everyone should be muted, but if you are not muted, let me just mute everyone just so that we don't have that. Perfect. Okay, go ahead now. We shouldn't have any of that background noise.
Sorry, I was muted for a second, but now we're good.
Oh, sorry about that. Hello.
Oh, hey, okay.
Okay, yes, you're good. Sorry. Yes, go ahead.
A reality of remote work is technical difficulties. So in any case, I don't think there is there's no one amazing central place I could recommend, but right now I would say that PowerToFly is a really great one because at least in my experience, all of the remote opportunities that I've found on PowerToFly are genuinely remote. And I think that's the biggest kind of issue with this. And as the industry, or as the tech industry, at least that's where I'm working, gets more and more involved with remote, I think that this will become a lot more transparent.
Oh yeah, I agree with that too. I think it's really important now for people to have that option, you know, and they've come out with so many studies saying people are more effective working from home. So thank you for that. Great. And so how do you know, based on what you said, you know, some of them aren't genuine. So how do you know if a remote company is legit?
So there's a few things, like, I guess I'll answer this question in two ways. the one way that I could look at it is the company itself legit? This I would say to kind of look for the same indicators that you would look for in any role, right? So do folks show up to do video interviews with you? You know, do you get the same kinds of indicators that you would get, like nobody's asking you to give, I wouldn't suggest you pursue any place that's asking you to give like a lot of personal information, or that, you know, wants to hire you before they've properly vetted you. So I would say expect a very similar interview experience that you would at any other company. You know, they may not be on site, but the same number of interviews, the same kind of content. So a chat with a recruiter, that sort of thing. And then how do you know if a role is legitimately remote? I would definitely confirm that with whoever the first person you talk to is. So if it's a recruiter or the hiring manager, just to be sure that you're on the same page. I know there are some companies that do partial remote or that expect a lot of travel. So there's a broad spectrum for sure.
And following up on that, would you say in your experience that the remote job interview process is more extensive than an on-site process? Hello? Oh, I think we may have lost. Oh.
Wow, I'm so sorry I got dropped. I hope, I hope this is better
It's
now.
all part of the remote experience.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to repeat just the small follow-up question. Would you just say that the remote job interview experience is more extensive than an on-site experience?
I wouldn't say it's more extensive. I would say it should be at least roughly similar. In a lot of cases, I think remote companies trust that you are doing this for the right reasons, that you will take the role seriously. So at least I personally don't try to vet remote candidates any more than I would candidates for a position on site.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So is there a lot more competition for remote jobs? And if so, how can somebody stand out? I think we might be having some technical difficulties. I think we lost Nicole again. Sorry about that. I'm sure everyone can relate to technical issues. I'm sure she'll hop right back on again, just like last time. And I want to say thank you, everyone, for coming to the chat. I appreciate this. So hopefully we can get her back on in just seconds. While we're waiting, if anyone wants to share where they're from. Oh, perfect. There we go.
Hoping this will be better. Sorry about that.
No, it's totally fine. This is all part of the process. So
I'm concerned because it still seems laggy, but I'm going to give it my best shot.
okay. So is there a lot more competition for remote jobs? And if so, how can somebody stand out when applying?
I would say there probably is, only because they're in such demand, right? Especially for folks who are not geographically located into a metro area. And I would say the best way to stand out is to kind of show if you don't have remote experience, having remote experience definitely helps, but showing an understanding of what remote work is like is also very helpful.
Hmm. Awesome. Perfect. Thank you for that response. And Sarah wanted to share that based on what she sees in her field, the answer is yes. It seems that jobs that post as remote have many more applicants, perhaps even 100% more. Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. Perfect. So we'll jump right into the next question. So, would volunteer work be substantial as experience for a remote role?
This is an interesting question. So I think, at least from the hiring manager perspective, I would say if we're talking about some sort of remote volunteer experience, that would definitely, like if you've had to interact with folks who are in another time zone or just not located in the same place as you, that would certainly be helpful. And then if that is in combination with work experience that you've had that's perhaps on site, there's definitely some lines that you can draw there. So I think any experience is definitely helpful. And it's kind of looking to highlight the parts of it that would be relevant to the role that you're applying for.
Right, right. And that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Perfect. Okay, so let's get into the next question. Now, do you have any good tips for phone interviews that will make you stand out from the crowd? This is a good question.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, most of the interviews I do, I guess I would call them phone interviews. A lot of times they are on a platform like Zoom. So at least you do get to kind of see the other person's face. But I think standing out from the crowd in terms of remote work, I guess kind of connects to what I said before, which is either being able to speak about remote experience that you might have, or just understanding what the challenges of remote are. And I think we can talk a little bit about those going forward.
Perfect, perfect. And Fatima comments that it seems like a lot of remote jobs are IT related, design, developer, etc., and that it's a lot of work and time finding a non-IT job. So I don't know if you wanted to respond to that comment a little bit before moving forward to the next one in your experience.
Yeah, so I mean, I do work in engineering, so it's for me that's definitely, I can see that it's very popular and gaining in popularity in my industry. I do know that, I mean, while I do work for a tech company, we have roles that are not necessarily developer designer. You know, we do have folks who work for HR or sales who are remote. So I think as companies start to expand out that way, more different kinds of roles will be available.
Oh, definitely, definitely. I agree with that. And I think more companies are seeing the value in having remote employees just based off on how much more they produce than somebody in the office based
Yeah,
on
for sure.
studies and just the convenience of it, no? Perfect.
Yeah,
So,
I would think so. I know I'm more productive at home.
my gosh, me too. I mean, really, it's incredible how much more I do at home, even with the baby to distract me sometimes. So, so what does a typical remote software engineer interview involve? Are take-home problems and skill assessments typical?
So I can talk about this from the perspective of my last two roles, which may be helpful. And I would say, in short, or to answer the second part of the question, are take-home problems and skill assessments typical? Yes. They can manifest in a lot of different ways. I think I've seen the industry move a lot more toward what I would call take-home assessments. So you might be given a small problem or a sample code base to work in, and you're expected to solve some things and return it back to the interviewer. There are also, I think a lot of companies still do the equivalent of what a phone screen would be. So just some questions that you can answer verbally, followed by something like a take home. And then in a lot of cases, a take home will come with a follow-up where maybe somebody from the company will hop on and sort of pair with you to either expand on the problem or talk through your solution. So that's kind of a quick overview of what they've looked like in my experience.
Oh, okay. Okay, wow. Super interesting. Perfect. And what are the pros and cons for working remotely? This is a fantastic question. Not that the other ones aren't. That I think this is just a really good question. I think it's on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I could talk probably about this for an hour, but I'll try to keep it short. One of the things I will say is that I think at least for me personally, I still struggle sometimes with my family and friends to explain what my work actually looks like, and that I'm not just available to go off and do things during the day. However, conversely, I find that one of the harder things, like aside from people's perceptions, one of the harder things for me personally is actually not to work more than I should, because it's really easy. You know, I'm at home. Sometimes I'll take my laptop down into my dining room or, you know, my bedroom or whatever it is. And so the work can kind of creep back into your life very easily. And so you have to set some hard boundaries there. And I can talk a little about those as well. And then the pros are really just the flexibility it gives, and I think the ability to be comfortable where you're working. So for me, sometimes I like a lot of background noise or chatter, and in that case, I'll go to a coffee shop or a co-working space. And sometimes I really like the quiet and the comfort of being home, and so that then I'll just, you know, stay in my office or wherever I am at home. Um, and I think also just being able to do those little things that, like, when I was commuting to Manhattan, for example, I never had time to do laundry, and like, it's not a disruption to my day for me to just run down and throw some laundry in and be able to get a handle on that kind of thing too.
Oh my gosh. Yes. The two of the, I think, most important points that I certainly can relate to are the people, like the perception of remote work and assuming, oh, you work from home, like you can just do whatever, you know? And it's like, no, I actually need to work as if I were in an office, and then also that of trying to separate yourself from the job, because I think it's just so easy, you know, I don't know if you're online shopping or something, it's so easy to just say, oh, but you know, I could finish this thing that I left from Friday or I left from Tuesday. So I think it's definitely a lot of self-control that you have to have working remotely. I could definitely attest to that. Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you so
very
much.
easy,
Oh yeah.
very
Yes.
easy for those boundaries to get blurred for sure.
Oh yes. Yes. But it's a good practice for self-control, no? And that can, you know, move into other parts of your life, that can migrate into other things. So that's awesome. Thank you. All right. And so what tips do you have for staving off the loneliness of working at home, which I think you talked a little bit about, so, but dive more into that as well.
Yeah, so there's a few things at least that I try to do, and there's probably more that you know, that other folks would recommend. And if anybody has any, feel free to share them. For me, one is that I try to at least once a week either go to a co-working space, which for me requires a little bit of travel, and so sometimes that's not the option that I choose, or I will go to a coffee shop just to kind of enjoy the buzz of other people being around. And then outside of my workday, I try to make sure that I'm engaged in some sort of social activities to make sure that I am still having those human connections. So whether that be volunteering to help other people learn to code, or going to the gym where I see a bunch of my friends, or, you know, any other sort of group activity that you can do, I think it's really, really important to have those connections outside of work.
Definitely. I can definitely agree with that. Luckily, in my position and with the company, there's a lot of women who work from Buenos Aires. So we get together from time to time and co-work, but I can definitely see how the loneliness could become a struggle if you don't work in a place where you're close to other co-workers. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
And
another thing I'd say too is I try to regularly have also just remote chats with people that I work with, whether they're people directly on my team or people that I don't interface with as much. Because while it's not the same as physically going and getting a coffee with them, it does help to build those connections and chat about things that don't have anything to do with work.
oh yes, definitely. And trying to create that work environment, right? That I think it can be maybe a little bit more difficult when you work remotely, since you're not seeing these people every day in person. And so, you know, that's really important too. And Sarah likes to share that she keeps a monthly lunch with friends where she actually leaves the house. Yes, that is so important. And to catch up with your friends, right? So otherwise you just get consumed with work.
Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. And so the next question, what advice do you have about staying productive while working from home?
I think I have a lot of advice around this that works. It kind of cuts both ways. So in order to make sure that work doesn't bleed too much into your personal life and also that you're staying productive, I think it's important, and I do violate this rule from time to time, but I have an office that's separate from my regular living space. I try to spend as much of my work time in there as possible. That definitely helps because it can kind of create a separation in your mind of, this is the space where I work, and this is the space where, you know, I have my family and my pets or whatever. I also think it's really good to try to minimize those distractions. So it's very tempting to say, oh, you know, I'll just meet a friend for lunch and it ends up taking way longer, or I'll run some quick errands. So if I'm going to do something like that, I block out a specific amount of time for it. And I think it's really helpful to say like, hey team, I'm going to be out because I'm going out for lunch, which I think it's important to be able to do that. Or I'm going to be out because I have to run this errand, but I don't let it just turn into this sort of thing where I'm out for, I don't know, like an unspecified amount of time. And then also just trying to create whatever work environment is best for you at home. So if that means having certain equipment like a standing desk, or making sure that you have snacks and drinks available, whatever's going to make it so that you kind of don't end up wandering off often.
I know, because I think it can get so easy sometimes to just wander off, Oh, yes. I find that super difficult sometimes, especially because maybe in an office you're working with peers and, like, for example, your cell phone, right? Like, you can't really grab that during the day sometimes around your peers, but then when you have it just right next to you on the desk, it's like so easy to get into that. So yes, definitely. Perfect. So how are remote hours calculated and how are you evaluated? This is the question.
I'm sure this is very much different for every company. One thing that I found in the companies that I work for is that a lot of the remote arrangement is based around trust. So in our interview process, we're talking to people about what remote looks like, what our expectations are, and then we're trusting that we hired the right people to do the work, and that they will kind of uphold that agreement that we've made. So at least in the tech jobs that I've had, both in management and in front-end engineering, we're not logging hours. Nobody's monitoring when I'm online. In fact, when I'm not online, in Slack or whatever chat app we're using, the assumption is really that I'm focused on working on something, not that I've left my desk and I'm off doing something related. So I know it can feel a lot like your work isn't as visible when you're working remotely, but I think as long as there is that trust within the team and there are certain paradigms that have been established, that it's totally fine.
And I think that's also kind of the benefit about working remotely, like you talked about, being you yourself are more productive, probably maybe a little bit because of that trust that's expected on both ends, right? Trust in yourself that you're going to get the work done, because if you don't get the work done, you have to stay working later and taking more time out of your day for that. And then also just the trust from the company, like you said, and for your employees that you've worked with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the trust in remote work is the most important aspect. Remote work, it can't exist without that.
Definitely not. Definitely not. Perfect. Thank you for that. And so, are you in the same time zone as your company? And if not, has that affected you?
No, I am not. And yes, it has. So my company is based primarily in San Francisco, although we have become much, much more remote at Circle CI than we were in the past. And so we actually have people all over. We have folks in Europe, in Japan, plus all of the North American time zones. This is, and in my last role, we did have people distributed, though not quite as much. I guess the main effect that it has is it's very hard to set those boundaries, because a lot of times you'll want to have conversations with people in different time zones, and it can be difficult to get a mutual time that works for both of you. So I think that's been the biggest effect of that, is sometimes either if you're in a later time zone coming online and feeling like a lot has happened before you got there, or if you start early feeling like nobody's awake yet and then needing to catch up later with everybody. So it's important to kind of set expectations with everybody you work with, let them know what your working hours are, let them know when you're making an exception, like, oh, I can stay on late tonight to talk to you, but I can't make this a regular thing.
It's definitely important, setting boundaries, and especially if there's meetings that are happening, right? That either the whole company's involved or the whole team is involved. That can be really difficult when you have a big time difference of 4 hours, 3 hours, or even if you're working from Europe and it's 5-6 hour difference. That can be really difficult. We have a few people who work from Europe, and I can see that difficulty. They're starting at like 9 in the morning when it's, like 4 in the morning for us. So that's very difficult.
And so I think another important point there is just trying to find ways to communicate asynchronously when possible. So not everything needs to be a meeting. Sometimes a Slack thread or an email thread, or sending somebody a recording of a meeting that happened is plenty sufficient, and means that they don't have to be online super early or very late in their time zone.
Of course. Perfect. All right. And the next question, how do you ensure your presence is felt in meetings and in team culture when you are the voice on the phone? And you touched a little bit about this. I think this is a fantastic question.
Yeah, so this is one where I'll give like a little bit of a backstory. I worked for a company a while back where we were all co-located in an office in New York, and we had one employee who was, I don't remember exactly where she was, but she would join on the phone all the time, and all of us were sitting together in one room, and she would be the voice on the phone. And to be honest, that never really worked because when you don't have a significant number of people who are working remotely, it's really easy to just get focused on what the co-located experience is like and forget about that person. And so I think the really important thing here is to make sure that if a company, and I think this is important to know when you're looking for a role, if a company is going to do remote, it's really important that it's a focus, whether it's remote first or at least remote, remote reliant, where the company can't function without its remote workers. And so the idea would be, if you do have a lot of people in an office together and one person joining from far away, everybody joins on their individual laptops or something like that, where you still kind of get the experience of everybody being on the phone. And then in a lot of cases, it really just helps for there to be other remote employees. And so I think it's really, really important to look for that remote culture where the company is making an effort to make life, bearable and easy, and to make work, fun to do even when you're remote.
Right. And probably they're more understanding of certain things when it's not a centralized co-working experience, like where they have a lot of on-site, probably if the majority of people are remote or a big portion of people are remote, there's going to be more understanding there for certain things, I can imagine. Right.
Yeah,
In your
I would say in companies that I'd say the best remote cultures are those that have like at least half of their people in remote locations, because then it's basically impossible to have a meeting or any other sort of interaction that doesn't need you to account for there being somebody remote or multiple people who are remote.
Right. That makes sense. Awesome. Okay, so have you been able to travel while you've been working remotely? If so, how did you juggle the work and how did it work out for you?
Yeah, actually, I do this quite a lot, and it's one of the reasons that I love working remotely. I love to travel. I actually do a lot of conference speaking, which is work, and so that's traveling for work. But I've also done personal travel while working remotely. And I think the important thing, the same way as it is when you're working from home, is to set boundaries, right? So for example, if I go visit my friend out on the West Coast, sometimes I'll say to my coworkers, you know what, I'm going to keep my East Coast hours. That means I'm going to get I'm going to get up super early. I'm going to work my full day. And then I still have the afternoon to spend doing whatever I want. But I think making sure you're really clear about what you're going to do and when, and then holding yourself to that is very, very important. And travel can be exhausting, so it's important to remember that as well. I actually just got back from a trip where I visited 3 cities, and by the end I was certainly very tired. So that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Oh my gosh, I can only imagine. Wow. And can I just ask, what was the biggest time difference you had with traveling? I don't know if you've traveled internationally or it was just within the country that you were traveling.
I have not yet undertaken international travel while working, although I would like to, but it's mostly just been, so I'm in the Eastern time zone, and I've traveled as far as the Pacific time zone, so it's a 3-hour offset from my normal work hours, which is pretty significant, but could definitely be more extreme.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, one of our employees is currently working from Indonesia, and so that's been difficult, with the time difference and everything. Whew. Yeah, wow. Perfect. All right. And so the next question, how have you found your responsibilities working remotely differ from working home every now and then?
Yeah, so I had this experience also when I was working in New York, where I would just work from home a few days a week. And I really loved that because it meant I didn't have to commute, but it was certainly different because you still kind of get the same, I guess, you get the same office experience, even if it's not every single day. So I think my responsibilities are generally the same, to communicate, to get my work done. In the case of working in management, to make sure that I'm checking in with my team. But I think the responsibilities on myself for making sure that I have kind of the right paradigms established around doing my work, those are where it gets really different. So if you're only working from home a day or two a week, and things are like a little unusual, you can get back into your routine when you get back to the office. But I think working from home means you really have to think about, how do I want to set up my work day? How do I want to set up my workspace?
And did you find that more difficult instead of just working solely remotely from home?
I thought it was more difficult to bounce back and forth from an office to, working from home than it was to just work from home all the time, because it's a more consistent experience. Every single day I'm waking up at the same time, getting ready and then heading up to my office, instead of, oh, well, today I've got to get on the train. That can be, I think consistency is really, really important.
And probably, I mean, what you were talking about before, that you have an actual set up space where you work from now. I don't know if that was your case before, but maybe that probably helped a little bit too in setting those boundaries, as well as a consistency and routine.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was working from home intermittently, it was like, oh, today I'll sit on the couch, and that's not always great.
No, definitely. Oh, yes.
Although it's tempting, don't get me wrong.
It is, right? Oh, yes. And if you got to finish that series, oh man. Okay, so
Yeah.
as the manager of a remote team, how do you keep them engaged with the department and other coworkers who are not remote?
There are, I think, two thoughts I have here. So one is that the one that I touched on before, which is making sure that the folks who are co-located are making sure that they keep in mind what the experience is like for the remote employees. So how they join calls, how they have conversations, how we communicate things. We do a lot of documenting conversations that happen, and try to avoid just having ones that are sort of exclusively happening in the office. And we move farther and farther from that with every person we hire that's remote, which is great. And then I think keeping folks engaged and connected, I also try to make sure that we do things like have the, one-on-one chats like I talked about, and also that we do actually prioritize getting together every now and then. So my team is actually planning an offsite for the first week of December, and during that time, we're going to prioritize face-to-face time and having conversations that are really hard to have remotely. So I do think I love remote work, but I do think it is important to kind of get folks together every now and then, because it solidifies those connections, and then you can bring that home with you when you need to have, conversations from home.
And just a side question. So while managing the coworkers and the coworkers that are not remote and the remote workers, have you found a difficulty in creating a fluid environment in the work and creating a harmonious environment in the work?
Not in the sense of, just getting everybody on the same page of how they're working. I think the hardest thing about remote work is just building connections, kind of like I talked about, but getting everybody on the same page about work. I mean, there's definitely a lot of tooling that can help you with that. So we use a lot of little bots that remind us of things, and we use a lot of different sources for documentation. So I guess those are some challenges, and I've maybe become so accustomed to them that I forgot that they even existed. But yeah, it's definitely something you have to be very, very intentional about. Every single thing you do is, is this going to work? Is everybody going to have access to this?
Right. Definitely. Perfect. Okay, and so what is the best way to let your team know what you're working on and that you're actively engaged?
There's two things here, I think. So letting your team know what you're working on. I'll talk about a couple of general practices, and then also about a couple of tools that I like. So, I mean, as an agile software development company, we use a Kanban board of some kind. I don't really think it matters what tool you use, but that's a really good way of knowing who's working on what at a glance. You have your cards in their various states, and you know who's up to what. That definitely helps. I think another thing that I really like is the concept of doing a stand-up. And this is going to look really different depending on what the time zone distribution is and what the team can do. So in some cases, it will be a call that you get on where everybody just kind of goes around, talks about maybe how they're feeling about their work and also what they're working on, asking for help from others. And then in the cases where it's not possible to do it synchronously, I like to do a stand-up, like a thread in Slack, for example, where everybody just says, hey, today I'm going to be doing this and that. I have these dependencies, or I could use help from this person. And there's also a really cool tool that does this, and they did not pay me to say this, but it's called Range, and they basically have automated what I used to do manually for a very long time of allowing people to provide daily updates of what they're working on, and also like little questions that people can connect about every day. Some of them have to do with work, and some of them are personal, like what's your favorite hobby outside of work, or like what's your favorite tool to minimize distractions. And so those are like cute little things that you can answer as well that help people build connections. And then letting people know that you're actively engaged. I like to use that stand-up concept when you're writing your update to say like, hey, I'm online now and you can expect to hear back from me. And then I also like to tell folks when I'm leaving for the day or any time that I step out. And then basically they can expect a response from me any other time. So unless I've said I'm leaving for the day, or I'm stepping out for lunch, or I'm gonna take an hour to go heads down on this activity, they can expect that they'll hear back from me.
Oh, that's awesome. And so Ashley wanted to know, what is the software called that you just mentioned?
Oh, Range, it's range.io, or no, range.co. I know that you all normally do follow-ups after these, so I can send out a link for that.
Oh, that would be perfect. Sorry. And is it a part of Slack, or is it a separate software?
It's its own web application, and it also has a Slack integration, which is really cool. So you can see a lot of different stuff on their dashboard, and then you can also have it post messages to Slack for you.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's super cool. That's a really good thing to have, because I mean, not just for keeping up with the daily tasks of everyone, but also building that culture. That I think it's important if you're working on site, if you're working remote in any capacity. It's really important to have that nice work environment where you feel comfortable, but also to build those connections, which is obviously harder remote, as you've stated. But it is really important, just to keep up with, oh, what is everyone doing? What plans do we have? And somebody asked, there's so many tools available to use. Does the company choose that for you, or is it an individual and getting others to join?
I think it depends on the size of the company and the way that, I guess, procurement works where you're working. I've been in a lot of environments where it's fine to just say, hey, I'm going to test this thing out. And then at the point at which, somebody needs to pay the bill for it, that becomes another conversation. But I think it's important to have consistency within the company. And so it's great where, I don't know, for example, like my company right now is using like Jira for our Kanban boards, and everybody uses it because then it's easy to kind of, if you need visibility into another team's work, you know where to go to look for it. But I don't know, let's say you're looking for a tool to run remote retros. Not everybody needs to be using the same thing for that.
Yeah, and oh man, there are so many different programs out there to use. It's so hard. It's trial and error pretty much, right? Until you find the right thing. And I think
my
that's
recommendation. Is to just try things out.
Oh yeah, and it's an evolving process, right? Because something that works right now might not work in a couple of months or even next year.
Yeah, especially as the team scales in size or the work becomes different. I think I would always recommend reevaluating what you're using as soon as you start to feel pain, say, is this something I can solve? Like, should we try to push through it, or should we investigate something else?
Definitely. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Yeah.
Perfect. So is it possible to land a remote job in the US from the EU? And what are the usual legal requirements? And then the follow-up on that, how do you apply for remote jobs that's remote, but usually say Europe only or USA only? So this person's from Africa and they find it harder to get a job if they're not from the US or from Europe.
This is definitely a unique challenge that I think is one of the things that remote companies are trying to figure out as they go. So for example, my last company could only hire folks in the US and Canada because there are legal requirements to be able to hire people in different countries. So is it possible to land a remote job in the US from the EU? Definitely, only if the company has kind of gone through the process required to be able to do that. So for example, my company, Circle CI, we definitely hire folks in the EU. I also know that we've definitely had to do a lot of work to get to that point. I don't know what the exact legal requirements are, but I'm sure that folks in HR do. And then for jobs that say Europe only or USA only, I think it's a little bit harder there because those requirements are there for a reason, because the company might only legally be able to hire in that place. I do know that contractors, it is possible to set up as a contractor and to work for a company that way. So there may be some ways to do that. But I'm not super familiar with exactly what the details would be there. But I do know that I have seen that happen in different companies I've worked for.
Wow. Well, and I'm sure as things are evolving and more companies are switching to remote with globalization and everything, it should hopefully become easier and easier, for people to find those jobs.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so now we have come to the questions part, and I don't know if anyone has any questions. I guess I have a question, so I can start this off. So I'm wondering, what ways, I mean, I know that you said setting up stand-ups and setting up meetings. What other ways have you found unique to create a culture for people that are not close to other coworkers like yourself, it seems? So what can you do? Maybe a retreat or...
Yeah, a retreat's a huge one if you can pull it off. And there are different ways to kind of make that happen. So budget is going to make it look different for like how long you can go or where you can go. My team right now is very well distributed from Europe all the way to sort of Pacific time in the US. And so that makes finding a location an interesting problem, but it's definitely doable. I could make recommendations about that, but I won't get too detailed. Look for a major airport, a major city, right? Because they're cheaper to fly into. One thing that we did in my last company that was really great and we're actually going to be doing it at Circle CI as well, is instead of having everybody like stay in individual hotel rooms, we would get sort of like a big house together, and that was really cool. I mean, everybody still has a private bedroom, but it kind of allows to have some shared spaces where there's no expectation around like, oh, if we want to get together, we've got to go out to dinner, or we've got to go to a bar, or we've got to plan some sort of activity. We could just all sit around and talk or cook something together or play video games or board games, which is really nice. I think that one is one that I really like too, is like, I think it's great to organize remote activities that maybe aren't necessarily work related or directly work related all the time. So allowing people to do some sort of remote gaming or chatting about, things that aren't necessarily specifically related to work. And I think I touched on this with range, but I also just used to do it in my stand-ups where we would do sort of like an icebreaker question, and they'd be silly things like, what was the worst fashion trend you ever involved yourself with? Or like, what's your favorite kind of salsa? Or, just silly things. You get to know people, and then you have conversations to have that can follow up from that sort of on the side.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. Awesome. Okay. And somebody really liked the idea that you threw out of it. I think it's about the house. They said that's an awesome idea.
Cool.
That is a great idea. And I don't think it's something that you would think of until somebody maybe threw the idea out there, right? Like, so that's great.
And I think it's really important, I will say, to check in with folks about what they feel comfortable with. So I always check in with my team, like, are there any accommodations that you need? Is there anything that would make you feel more comfortable with this? So I always just like to check in with folks before we plan something.
Perfect. That's great advice. And so we have a few questions coming in. So what advice could you give someone who will start looking for a remote job in web development? This comes from Layla.
Advice to give someone who will start looking for a remote job in web development. So I think this is probably one of I would say, the industries that has the most plentiful remote jobs. So definitely just taking a look at, I know, like, in addition to PowerToFly, Stack Overflow allows you to filter by remote. There are a lot of different ways that you can find remote jobs. Twitter, interestingly, like, there are a lot of really great threads where you can find remote companies. But I think just making sure that, at least the thing that I think is the most important when I'm hiring an engineer for a remote role, is focusing in also on your communication skills, because there is, I think, a higher burden of being very, very intentional about your communication, whether it's on a Zoom call or being cognizant of somebody else's time zone, or making sure that you write your Slack message exactly as you intend it, because you don't get the advantage of seeing the other person's face. So I think really, really making sure that your communication skills are strong and that you can demonstrate that is really important.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And then Lisa asked, depending on size, doing something unexpected or rather non-technical is, this is not a question. This is in regards to your comment about creating that work environment. They said, depending on size, doing something unexpected and rather non-technical is memorable. Sending postcards, exchange gifts, definitely for people's birthdays or whatever it is, or great moments in their lives now.
Yeah.
And so Leila said, thank you for your answer. And so Rastana said, what kind of projects do you recommend for an entry-level engineer to stand out for a remote role besides passion projects? Okay, that's great. That's a good question.
I think one that immediately comes to mind, and a lot of different places make accommodations for this for somebody who's new, but like contributing to open source projects is a really, really great way to, one, like get your skills out there. And a lot of projects will have you know, specific issues that they're looking to be resolved that are very straightforward, and then you can start with those and kind of get in deeper as you go. And it's also really good for the remote aspect because you're not on site with those people, right? And they may have feedback for you when you make a pull request or something. And so you can kind of go back and forth, show that you can communicate well. And that's a really good way of doing that.
And then Priya asks, as a manager, could you comment meeting your manager's expectations and the team's deliverables or securing resources or projects for your team?
Yeah, so I mean, meeting your manager's expectations, I would hope, at least as a manager, that those are always very clear, regardless of whether you're remote or on site. So if you don't have regular one-on-ones with your manager, I would highly recommend asking for those to make sure that you can kind of set clear expectations, both as I like to tell my reports, both what they can expect from me and what I expect from them, because I do have certain expectations of myself that I want people to know about in terms of like what kind of feedback they'll get from me or when I'll be available. The team's deliverables, I think it's really important to make these very clear and have the long-term goals of the team as well as what is expected to be delivered in a visible place that everybody can find all the time. And then securing resources or projects for your team. I guess I'd ask for a little bit more detail there. I'm not sure exactly what is being asked in that last part, but hopefully some of that is helpful.
Okay, so hopefully Priya can follow up on that. And then Rosanna says, thanks for your previous answer. And then Kimberly asks, says, thanks, Leila. I had a very similar question re web development and visual design in parentheses. It's quite difficult finding junior level positions when you see so many mid to senior level position openings posted. Sorry.
Yeah, this is an industry problem that at least I know I'm trying to help with, and a lot of other companies care about as well. Is one of the hardest things to do is, you know, more junior or entry level positions. Definitely, it would be wrong for the company not to provide mentorship and support to those people, and it is a lot harder to do that remotely. So I know I personally and my company has been trying to figure out ways where we can do this better. And so hopefully that, I don't know what else to say other than hopefully that will get better over time for sure.
Good to hear there's consciousness about this issue.
Yeah. Oh
so
yeah, for sure.
That's great. And then Ali asks, are remote web development salaries usually a lot lower than in-person roles? What could a junior level developer expect to earn?
I think there's a big spectrum here, and different companies approach this in different ways. So one that's really popularly known is that GitLab publishes a sort of like a salary calculator based on your location and like the role, and then what they would expect to pay you based on that. So I wouldn't say that across the board that they're usually lower. I have found them to definitely be highly varied, and I think it depends on the stage that the company is in, what they're trying to accomplish, where specifically they're looking to hire. So like I'm in New York, salaries are very high in New York. Can remote companies like always compete with that? And would I expect them to? Maybe not, you know, but in some cases they really do. And a lot of companies will, I think, pay you kind of based on where you are. So I know at Circle CI, we also do some salary bands dependent on location, which is really, really nice because it does take into consideration my cost of living or the cost of living of whoever it is. So on the whole, I would say no, they're not usually a lot lower, but there probably are companies out there that maybe are trying to, you know, hire people in areas where the cost of living is lower. I don't know. But yeah, it's definitely very, very varied. And what could a junior level developer expect to earn? I think that's going to vary kind of a lot depending on where you are and what exactly the role is.
Perfect. And Kimberly said, thanks so much for your previous answer. And I just had a quick question for you as well, following up on what you first said, that you studied music and then you made the switch to tech. And so I
Sure.
was a little bit interested in that, in the book. I know that you did talk about it before, but maybe you could just touch briefly on that, because I think that's so interesting. And it's very common today. I don't know about anyone else on the chat, but you can see a lot of people coming from teachers and going into tech, or artists going into tech.
Yeah, so I had a sort of long and winding career path that I'll try to give the short version of. But I did study music in college in New Paltz, and then I found that was a very difficult. I wanted to perform, so I found that was a difficult, I don't know, industry to find a job in. I ended up actually working in retail banking for a while, and that didn't kind of give me like the intellectual challenge that I wanted, but I did actually kind of get into a management role there, and that helped me a lot later on down the road. So then I attended a boot camp, which was a really, really awesome experience, and also definitely a huge investment of time and energy, but absolutely worthwhile. And after I did that, I worked in front-end engineering for a while, and then kind of was able to find my way back to my passion for helping people and doing management stuff by sort of combining that experience of doing engineering with the management experience that I had before. And that's sort of how I ended up where I am now.
Wow, what a great school to go to music for. Well, so that's really interesting, because I think there's this kind of maybe idea that people have that you have to have a tech background or a science background or math to get into tech. So that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think that I would almost say, at least for me, I am not necessarily looking for anybody with any particular kind of background, whether it be computer science or something else completely. I think everybody brings something different to the table. And if you have the skills, like I spent a lot of time trying to justify why I made a career change, and I don't think we should have to do that. So I think I think people, who have worked in other industries or done different jobs often have like really good work habits or really good communication skills. And those are things that maybe somebody with a different background wouldn't have. So I would say, go for it if anybody's interested.
Awesome. And actually, Allie says, which boot camp? I'm applying for one now. Do you think you could go from a boot camp to a remote job, or would you recommend taking an in-person role first?
So I went to App Academy in New York City. I know there are plenty of other really awesome boot camps out there, but I could certainly recommend them. They were great. And I know they have actually published their entire curriculum for free. So like if you can't afford to go or you can't attend on site, it's actually all available online. I think it's probably still kind of, it's a different challenge to get through it that way because you have to be very self-motivated, but it's surely possible. Do you think that you could go from a boot camp to a remote job, or would you recommend taking an in-person role first? I think a lot of if you can get a remote role and you feel really confident about sort of the other skills that you need outside of engineering, if you find one, I love it. I totally recommend it. It was something that I had been looking for from the moment I graduated, but I found that they were very difficult to find. And so I would recommend taking an in-person role if you can find one. I think it gives you that opportunity to tap people on the shoulder that you might not otherwise get. And then as your confidence builds, it might feel a little bit easier to kind of be remote and not have that same kind of support. And as we as an industry figure it out, hopefully I won't be saying that in a year or two.
And I think that's what's interesting about the tech industry. It seems to be evolving very rapidly, right? I mean, like technology in general, but I think it's really interesting. So awesome.
Yeah.
And so Judith asks, what advice can you give for someone switching from software engineering to AWS cloud services, which will put me in an entry level in a cloud environment?
I think in a general sense that, if anybody wants to switch kind of specialties within the industry, I would say lean into the skills that you already have, right? So while you may not be the most technically experienced person in whatever role that you're applying for, you still have a lot of experience in how to work, in how to communicate, and also just how technology works in general, right? Because a lot of different software follows the same kinds of patterns. So, it may require kind of taking a little bit more of an entry-level role, but I don't believe it would be a barrier to getting hired at all.
Thank you. And Priya follows up and she says, thanks for your response. I think a good relationship and one-on-ones with your manager might help you get new projects, interesting work for your team. And that's in response to her comment and question before.
Yeah, absolutely. Keeping a tight feedback loop with your manager, I think, is probably important in any role, but even more so in a remote role, to just clarify what the expectations are and, you know, what you should be working on at any given time.
Awesome. And then for anyone who's not in tech, myself included, so now is it difficult to make that switch into learning other languages? I mean, you did talk about it a little bit with the last question, but is it hard to pick up new languages?
I mean, there are definitely nuances that make it, you know, that make it require some time and energy to do. But I, for example, when I was hired in one of my earlier roles, had been studying JavaScript in depth for a long time, and the role required a decent amount of Python, and I was able to pick it up fairly quickly. I think, like I said, the nuances will come to you as you get more experience, but a lot of the same patterns you will find to be true, and then you can kind of take your knowledge, do a little bit of research, and then apply it as you go. I've never really looked for people with, unless it was something extremely specialized. When we're hiring, I think, you know, if somebody has a lot of experience and they might be new to a certain language, I wouldn't say that's a barrier to being hired at all.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. And I don't know if anyone else has any other questions, but feel free to ask. But I wanted to ask you, Nicole, what other advice, or any advice that you didn't cover, what advice would you give to somebody who's either looking for remote or is currently working remote and maybe they're trying to figure out a way to do it better?
So for folks who are looking for remote roles, I know for me, it definitely didn't happen instantly. You know, like I've said a couple of times before, at least for the tech industry, and I think just in general, a lot of companies are moving toward remote, but it's going to take a while for it to catch on really as much as, you know, I think it ultimately will. So stick with it. Don't be discouraged. I had wanted a remote role from the moment that I graduated from boot camp, and it took me about 2 years to get to that point. But once I had kind of a little bit more experience and I was able to point to times where I had worked remotely effectively, even if it wasn't full time, that was when, you know, hiring managers felt, I think, a little bit more confident about my ability to do that. And then for folks who are already working remote, I think there's a lot of really great tools out there, and sort of just looking for those, reading articles, finding different resources, because I think tooling is the thing that's going to help us all do this and solve this problem, right? Whether it be tools for asynchronous stand-ups or like ways to do remote gaming together or anything like that. That's that technology is what's going to keep us connected. And so doing that and setting boundaries for yourself, I think is really important for anybody who's working remote. So if you're feeling discouraged by being lonely or feeling like you're working too much, you know, find ways to set those boundaries for yourself. I know somebody who gets up and takes a walk every morning to replicate the idea of having a commute, right? So like walking around the block and then coming back in just to reset your mind. So there's a lot of different ways you can fool yourself into kind of having a clear line between your work and your home life.
That's a good one. My personal thing is I live in Buenos Aires. I don't have any family around, and my husband's family isn't too involved. So basically, once my nanny leaves, I have to be with Gabriel. So that, I have to tell you, that has been super effective in keeping me away from work. So for anyone who doesn't have kids or doesn't want kids, I would definitely recommend maybe getting a pet, and that could be a really good way to help you, because you have to take it out. I mean, more than likely a dog, right? But you know, you have to take care of the pet too, so that might help. That's just my personal thing, but yeah. And so awesome. Thank you so much for everything. It was so great to listen to you, and I definitely picked up some tricks, setting boundaries and everything. So I wanted to say thank you so much for being here, and thank you everyone for attending it. We will be posting this on the page, and then we will email it out to everyone. So thank you so much for attending, and I had a great time, and I hope you did as well, Nicole. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks a bunch.
Thanks. Bye.